So good afternoon, everyone. I know today is your last day of the conference, which is great to welcome you here in Berlin. You see the weather is already preparing you to say this is it, this is the end, before the winter starts here in Germany soon. It's with a great pleasure, really, for myself to welcome you in this old building, which is more than 100 years old, where it is really a house of multinationalities. For us to come even to this district in Berlin is also very unique, because as you can see when you go out of the building, it's not typical German environment, isn't it? It's full of expats coming together in Germany and making it their home. And I'm sure you noticed it very clear. And Berlin itself was always predicted as the place of more openness to international and allowing communities to integrate. In BSBR, we try to do exactly the same. We have over 120 nationalities of students, and we have 170 staff for more than now 60 different nationalities. So it gives you some ideas of how multi-culti, as we say in Germany, this organization is. I wanted to say very short about something that I found that in the coming months and years will become very important for everyone in the education environment. Myself as the CEO of GAS Germany, which under myself there are campuses in Dubai, in France, in Spain, in the Netherlands, in Greece, and of course here in Germany, I see the mobility of students becoming more and more part of what they're expecting these days. And you know, the academic system of the US and England, and of course the Bologna structure, are very different from each other. And they not always are as easy to merge from the ECTS or UK credits or the American system. But what we see is really the interest of students to try to have more experience in their studies. Many years ago, it was something very unique for a university to have two or three locations for an executive MBA. And now almost every institution have Erasmus and connectivities of international exchange or dual degree awards or other benefits that actually creating this so-called environment of experimental. We noticed lately that the collaborations are not always that easy, because the world actually, if we look at it, becoming more and more competitive, where because of political environment, things change. I'll give you an example. We are in Germany. 15 years ago, you will come to a recruitment event called ISAF, for example, and no one would have thought that Germany will become number one or number two in international students direction or center. It was always the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and even Canada. Recently, Canada and Australia changed their policy in immigration and students and put caps. Suddenly, Germany became a major direction for hub for students. Spain changed the regulation too. 2 years ago. How many Spanish people we have here? We don't have now. I think they left maybe.
There were 7, I think.
Yes, but they are very happy now in Spain because the rules changed there too. Suddenly working rights are part of the integrated part of the education, post-study work visa, partners and siblings can come with the students. It will become probably very soon the major direction of education. I'm saying it because I see the stats how Madrid becoming more and more the most attractive location, and the amounts of institution wants to enter Madrid right now is just unbelievable. what's happening there. So Germany is definitely one of the top. Spain is becoming or will be on the direction to be. In France, we also see that with the vocational studies and with the academics, they are really reaching because of 2 or 3 things that are important for students' mobility. Employability, entering via education because it's where there is an interest of human resources, and of course benefits for them when they are coming to the institution or to the country. To sum it up really very short, I feel that more international collaborations will actually secure a lower risk for educational institutions in the future and will actually mitigate this risk of putting on one direction and one space the growth of the education. Also, the exchange of knowledge between international institutions helps for academic research, but also understanding movement of change. Education moving more AI and more digitalization, unfortunately, since COVID, created a much more different aspect. So if we look at this all combined, mobility, digitalization, and of course opportunities of networking for the students will actually create probably the best or the most attractive program for them. I'm not talking about academic excellency because this I'm sure everyone have it in mind. But all those elements will create actually for us the best success. And I think more events, not just about the sustainability and the importance of quality of education and everything that PRME for sure stands for, and it is an extremely important, and we of course believe in that, as we would not be here. But with that, there is also the understanding of what the global and the communities needs. And that can actually help us via more events like this, where we can exchange knowledge, we can actually see where the global needs and where education can go to what we call it the modern future programs of education, which will definitely not be, what was it, 5 or 10, or even when we were students 20 or more years ago. So I really, once again, thank you for all of you to come here. I hope you really enjoy your time, and I'm giving Tassos to welcome the next one.
We have to give him officially. Because of the rainy days in Berlin, he will need that.
I need to get another one, or what?
Yes,
no, I give it to him.
I did not know.
You should have, one. I said, why do I get the bags? So, okay. Then I have to say thank you also, because it was really an amazing conference. So we still have some program points here, but it was really cool, and I also appreciated very much your room. So nice here, I was also working at a very international business school the last years, and we also had 75 nationalities on campus, and this is for me, I think as a professor, the most inspiring aspect of an international business school, if you have the connection to all the different countries and all the different levels, and you learn so much. And the same here with the conference, due to the fact that you can only join one track after the other, so I was really unhappy that I can't see the other ones, but the ones I joined had been amazing. I learned so much, so many takeaways. I have everything on my computer, so I will summarize this. Thank you very much, and great that at least a few are here. I know that the afternoon of the last day is always difficult, but thank you very much, and thank you to BSBI for this great host, and that you did this on a very short notice, and you did an amazing job. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So now, I hand over this.
Thank you.
I always wanted to have something like this, so I'm very happy.
Thank you.
This is really cool.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, pictures, she wants a photo. Yes, of course. Thank you so much. Thank you.
also well. Okay, so welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon and to see the room still so crowded. And thank you also to Tassos for inviting me to give this keynote. I'm actually not a researcher of responsible management education, but I research responsible management practice. And of course, as a professor, I'm a practicing educator, if you want, so I reflect about these issues a lot. So I'm a professor of business administration at the Leuphana University in Lüneburg. I moved there about a year ago, not least because the university is actually in Germany. I think it's fair to say a front runner when it comes to research on sustainability and really promoting a sustainability agenda and also integrating this notion of responsibility and sustainability very systematically into its curriculum. So it's an exciting place to be for anyone who is interested in these topics. So my plan for today is to talk, maybe I move back to the title, to talk about an area where we see a lot of changes happening when it comes to responsible management practice, the area of business and human rights, in particular in the context of global supply chains. That's an area that I've researched for many years now and where we see a lot of governance innovation. Yeah? And where we see governance innovation, we also see changes in corporate practice. And the question that I want to reflect a little bit about after telling you about my research is, so how can we integrate some of these ideas then into our teaching, but also into business schools as a setting that is, of course, also part of a particular kind of market governed by a particular logic, the market logic that I will talk about now in my presentation. So I will start with talking a little bit about this bigger context, business and human rights in global supply chains. I will tell you about a research project that I've worked on for many years and that I'm still continuing to research on, some of the key findings from my perspective, and then what are the resulting challenges and implications for management practice and management education. So why care about business and human rights? Well, it's, as I mentioned, an area where we see a major policy change on multiple levels, too much to actually talk about in detail. But I'm drawing here on a paper by Judith Schrems-Sterling and colleagues, where they very nicely pitch how this human rights logic or governance system is really different from the way things were done before under the banner of voluntary CSR. Yeah, so, and why? Well, we see it in the term rights. It's a shift to a kind of legal rights-based approach based on a duty to care, a duty to avoid harm to people, which is very different from responsibility for people, employees, workers in global supply chains, not least as a kind of voluntary activity of multinational corporations in particular. And I guess many of you have heard of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, published in 2011, also after a longer process. And this publication has subsequently led to major changes also in national policy arenas and on a corporate level. Why is this context of global supply chains particularly relevant? Again, I guess in this room I don't need to talk about this a lot, but just a few words to give you some examples from the fashion industry, the global fashion industry. That's the industry I've researched a lot. This is just a selection of the SDGs I could tie to what happens in this industry, right? It's a massive economic sector, growing 400%. These are figures I've taken from McKinsey a while ago, so maybe it's a bit less now, but more or less that's what we're talking about. A huge percentage of which is actually thrown away. Yeah, so here we see, of course, major environmental issues, issues of overproduction, overconsumption. But we also have this issue of labor exploitation that has been accompanying this industry ever since, in addition to climate-related issues like industrial waste and emissions and so on. So for me, my driving aim in looking at this sector was always this question, okay, so many challenges are tied to this industry in particular. It can be seen as representative of many other global supply chains. And if we find a way of governing this industry more sustainably, then we're really onto something. Yeah? Then we have learned some models that we can maybe also transfer to other industries and other contexts. So what are some of the challenges in particular in this global supply chain context? Well, of course, there is no world government that can just set the rules and say these are the basic standards, environmental or social, that we need to consider. So we look at multinational enterprises as a kind of force for good. That was often the idea, that especially in countries with weaker institutions, these companies can actually bring some good practices. We see that that doesn't necessarily happen on a large scale, not least because they do not really face incentives, economic incentives, to act more responsibly. Yeah? So the appeals we're left with are often moral and normative appeals, not really any hard binding legal obligations to act responsibly. And this is then mixed up, of course, with a complicated market environment that the corporations themselves find themselves in addition to obvious managerial challenges of managing these global webs of producers and suppliers spanning around the world. So there are many issues that make responsible management quite difficult. And given that, we have seen a lot of evidence that voluntary CSR activities, even though companies have invested a lot into them, they've developed what some would describe as quite complex voluntary CSR infrastructures, yeah, starting with codes, but then moving into multi-stakeholder initiatives and capacity building, and investing really quite a lot of money and resources. The system itself and the structural challenges have really remained unaddressed. And this shift in logic, I mean, this is the question that I'm interested in right now. This shift in logic towards business and human rights might change something about that, but it's also a bit too early to know at this stage. So here, this is a reference I like to show what the limits are of these voluntary infrastructures by Tim Bartley, a colleague who has researched this a lot. He has written a great book summing up basically decades of research under the title Rules Without Rights. Yeah? And this is accompanied by a figure where you see, okay, the number of initiatives has grown, yeah? But this hasn't really substantively improved workers' lives. Yeah? So that's, in a very, very short nutshell, what the problem is. Now, this business and human rights agenda, I've looked at it in particular in the context of Germany, of course, but also on an EU level. This is just an example to show the timeline by which this logic is sort of manifesting itself. Yeah? So I mentioned in 2011, the Ruggie principles, as they're also called, have been published. Several countries have set up national action plans to see how these principles could be implemented. Germany has, in this process, kept a commitment to voluntary obligations by corporations, but with a little twist of saying, okay, we'll evaluate what companies have done, and if they haven't changed voluntarily, we will come up with a law. And surprise, they didn't change substantively enough voluntarily. So Germany has passed a supply chain due diligence law, along with several other countries and along with a legal initiative on the EU level. So this is kind of the shift in governance on a policy level that we see happening in this area. Okay, so now moving on to the research that I've done in particular. So I was part of a large project, a research project, or I was leading the project funded by Volkswagen Stiftung Foundation, in addition to some other foundations in the UK and Sweden, where we took, I would say, probably the most systematic and comprehensive look at what happened in the governance of garment supply chains since the very tragic accident of the collapse of the Rana Plaza factory in 2013. So now this is actually quite a long time ago, but the questions we asked at that time are really still really relevant today, and we're seeing a process that continues. So we surveyed workers in Bangladesh, we surveyed factories in Bangladesh, and we surveyed more qualitatively lead firms in 4 countries, including in Australia, and a colleague who also participated in the project is actually here in this room. We also surveyed the transnational level, governance level, talking to trade unions, NGOs, and so on, to really gain a comprehensive picture of is anything changing, and if yes, what is changing? And the impulse that kind of drove companies into this is summed up quite nicely by this quote from a CSR manager saying, okay, what Rana Plaza told us is that whatever we were doing, and some companies were really doing a lot, it didn't work. Yeah, it clearly wasn't sufficient to prevent an accident like that from happening. And Rana Plaza was actually an accident that many in the industry would say was a disaster waiting to happen. It was kind of clear something would happen and no one did anything about it. Yeah. And again, in a nutshell, we've published a report with our results. Kind of what we concluded was, okay, some things certainly did improve for workers in Bangladeshi garment factories. The factories have gotten safer, the building structure has gotten safer. The workers have been more informed about their rights, for example. They felt sometimes more able to speak up. Yeah, so there have been improvements. But again, these were not necessarily systematic changes. Yeah, and especially what we heard from the workers was that the kind of level of stress and abuse in the factories has actually gone up. Why? Because the factories were squeezed in a way between increasing demands for being responsible and purchasing prices not increasing, yeah, and on the contrary, even decreasing, yeah. So in a way, we see the spiral of blame, like who's responsible then for these problems? So workers blame managers, the managers blame the buyers, and the buyers blame the industry, yeah. They say, okay, it's the competition, we can't really do anything differently. So this was then an impulse to look further into, okay, so what then? If this is the game, yeah, if no one is really responsible, it's the competition that is responsible, it's then the particular market structure that makes it impossible for companies, even those that take these issues quite seriously, yeah, they're not all the bad apples, no? Many do really care about these issues and about the workers, if they feel so heavily constrained to really do anything about it. So we looked at that question more systematically in a study that was published in the Academy of Management Journal, where we followed research by colleagues, including Oliver Lasch, who's in the room here, who speak about the logic of responsible management as a new logic that needs to manifest itself in actually an environment that is governed by a different logic, by a particular kind of market logic. Yeah? And we draw here on research from CSR that is also now more openly recognizing that, okay, there are systemic constraints on responsible management in the current market environment. So to briefly introduce this concept of institutional logics, because that's also what I want to use later to reflect about changes in our management education practice. So logics are seen as socially constructed systems of values, beliefs, and so on that guide people's behavior. And originally it's a sociological theory that applies to the level of society, and different societies are structured actually by similar logics, but these logics take a different form in the context of different societies. And one of these logic is the logic of the market, yeah, but there are many others. There's the logic of the family, the logic of the corporation, and so on, and the logic of religion. So that basically means you as an individual also, you would behave differently if you're at home, yeah, governed by whatever you associate or is associated with the logic of the family, than how you would behave if you're a market actor, yeah, participating in the economy. And these logics are quite stable, that's why they're called logics, and also quite influential. Yeah, they shape very strongly the way we think and act. And if we say, okay, responsible management is a new logic, yeah, it's a logic that actually is a hybrid between different logics. There's a bit of market in it, there's a bit of cooperation in it, but there are also other kinds of values in it. This logic is quite fragile because it needs to establish itself in a field that is governed by other logics that are very well established. Yeah? And in particular, given that we're looking at the global industry, the logic of the market. Yeah? And also here, of course, when we look historically, this logic has not always been the same. Yeah? There are different versions of the market. Yeah? In Germany, we always differentiate the traditional, more corporate capitalism from the American financialized capitalism and so on. So we can already here see the market logic is something that is quite dominant in a certain way, but also not necessarily unchangeable in that it can have different facets. Given that responsible management, and often this is embodied by CSR managers, yeah, in these large multinational corporations, has to establish itself in a context that is governed by a particular form of market logic, emphasizing competition, emphasizing profitability. We see empirically that responsible management is always heavily constrained. I always like this picture of David and Goliath, no? So there's this really dominant thing, and there are these CSR managers who try to bring in different impulses, but their efforts are very often curtailed at an organizational level for various reasons. So we have lots of evidence going into different kinds of mechanisms, and the message is always, to some extent, business as usual always wins, yeah, for various reasons. But also if we look at the sort of field level initiatives like multi-stakeholder initiatives, many would argue these are also actually influenced very strongly by the market logic, yeah, because they use reputational mechanisms. They're again voluntary initiatives, and in a way they legitimize states or public governance not doing anything. Yeah? So the logic of the state would actually be another logic. So this is kind of the area that we found also the companies that we studied in. Yeah? And we looked then more systematically at what these different companies were doing in different countries, and we kind of distinguished three groups. Yeah? So how were they responding? How were they talking about what happened at Rana Plaza? How were they talking about things that they were changing or not changing? So there was the one group where we could say they prioritize the market logic. So they say responsible management is really not our business. Okay, we do the minimum we have to do, like we have some codes and we do some auditing and so on. But we only engage in responsible management to the extent that it's bad for our business, yeah, to the extent that it affects our reputation. And these companies still exist. Yeah? So, and they're not necessarily a minority, not a majority either. Yeah? But they do exist. They just sit something like Rana Plaza out. Yeah? Consumers don't care anyway. That's sort of the gist. The largest group of firms would be somewhere in the middle. We call this accommodating responsible management within the market logic. Yeah? So they've given quite a lot of space. This is what we try to show with these bubbles. The small one is the responsible management. They give quite a lot of space to this idea of responsible management. But the lines are diffuse. Yeah? So the market logic always creeps into any efforts that they engage in. That's kind of, again, very briefly put what we found here. So the market logic is still seen as dominant. Yeah, and infusing really all of their activities. And then that's what we then found most interesting. There were some firms that really shifted the way they talked about these issues. Yeah? They started problematizing the dominance of the market logic. Yeah? They said, okay, well, the particular form of competition we have is a problem. There are certain things like living wages or safety for workers that we shouldn't compete on. Yeah? So they were quite openly addressing the problems that are inherent in the market logic itself. And they really fostered or put effort into trying to create what we ended up calling market-protected spaces. So kind of spaces that were shielded by certain rules or institutional infrastructures, if you want, to take things that the companies valued, like, or that society values, like worker safety, out of competition. Yeah? And this is the idea that I now want to explore a bit further in the rest of my talk. So what are market-protected spaces? Yeah, so this term, of course, comes from our theoretical framework rooted in the institutional logics perspective. So we say market-protected spaces are institutionally bound spaces that suspend the dominance of the market logic on selected issues based on a binding regulatory infrastructure that allows prioritizing responsible management practices. Okay, so this is quite a handful of a definition, but we have two examples that we observed in our case. Yeah, and the most prominent one, of course, was the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, an international agreement that was concluded in the aftermath of the event. And the logic of these agreements, yeah, follows very much this idea of collective bargaining that we know in countries like Germany or Austria, particularly in Europe. Australia also has it, I think. So these are, and this is not a kind of radical communist kind of idea. It's something that is quite established in very industrialized countries. Yeah? And the idea is very similar here to say, okay, what are these collective bargaining agreements about? They're about taking wages out of the competition. It's about setting a certain tariff that all companies in a given sector pay for the workers. So the competition is done on product quality or any other aspect, but not on wages. Yeah? And this is what we have in mind when we talk about these market-protected spaces. Yeah? So by taking something out of the competition, we're able to protect it. Yeah? So that doesn't mean we need to give up on capitalism. It doesn't mean we need to give up on markets. It doesn't mean we need to give up on competition entirely, but we need to limit it to areas where we want competition on and restrain it in other areas that we don't want competition on. Yeah? In this case, undercutting human rights, worker safety, wages, and so on. Yeah? But we can, of course, apply the same thinking when we talk about environmental standards, planetary boundaries, and so on. I'll come to that. So those companies that were really into this for many years were extremely frustrated. They came to this conclusion of saying, okay, this is a collective problem, and we cannot solve it as individual companies. We really need to change something on this level of the market. So these companies, of course, supported these kinds of initiatives, but, and we can see them, maybe just a brief word on that, we see them as a kind of, over time, shift towards more binding kinds of agreements. Yeah? So if we look at this whole area of private governance, we start with unilateral code of conduct, then we have industry-led, already collective initiatives, but all of these have a very voluntary character. Yeah? And what changes in this area of human rights, in this other half, is the involvement of another actor who actually is able to sign contracts with multinational corporations, which in this case are global union federations. Yeah? And we have, again, on a unilateral level, brand union agreements, so-called global framework agreements, which is a contract between one multinational corporation and one global union federation to create a binding commitment to consider and preserve labor standards, core labor standards. And with these two examples, the Court Act, I won't have time to talk about, we see the same logic, but on a collective level. Yeah? So involving multiple brands. In the case of the Accord, it was over 200 brands in the industry. Yeah? So all the major players in the industry. However, these are not necessarily stable solutions. Yeah? So we can say like, wow, well, now we found a solution. Yeah? But there are many constraints on these kinds of market-protected spaces themselves. So they're heavily contested. Yeah? The Accord was heavily contested, not least by actors from Bangladesh. It has recently been extended, however, and expanded to Pakistan. So in this process of contesting it, we can still see it as somewhat of a success story. Yeah? There's another initiative, Act on Living Wages, which is still struggling to get off the ground. Why? Because these kinds of agreements need a lot of institutional backing. Yeah? So collective bargaining is something that is a right in certain countries. It has a lot of tradition. Yeah? It's backed by national level institutions, which we don't necessarily have in the transnational realm. Yeah? So these are glimpses of a solution, but they're very fragile, we would argue. This is why it's now interesting to look at these shifts in public governance. Yeah? So when we ended this particular project, we were like, okay, so these agreements are good, but they're too fragile. But now we have the laws. Finally, we have the due diligence laws, and then we'll have all the problems solved. Yeah? And right now, we're looking at the what's happening in Germany, but also on the EU level. And it's too early to say because these laws are new. Yeah? but we've done a number of expert interviews. And these interviews indicate that things are not so easy either. And why? Well, I mean, on the one hand, there's a clear advantage, no, of these laws. We can say, okay, they define human rights. They try to do this, take human rights out of competition, yeah, because the laws create a level playing field. They apply to everyone, or at least the larger companies. So it really makes this an issue that cannot be ignored, yeah, which is different from a voluntary mechanism. It also puts the burden of proof kind of back onto brands, onto companies, away from suppliers. Yeah, in the voluntary regime, it was always, oh, it's these suppliers, the bad apple suppliers in these bad apple countries, and it's their kinds of problems. Now it's like, no, it's as a lead firm, this is your responsibility. If you don't do human rights due diligence in your supply chain, you are to blame, no? Which is a real shift in the logic of responsibility as well. But in a nutshell, the law doesn't execute itself, right? So it depends a lot on how it will be enforced. In Germany, there's a public administrative supervisory body who is in charge of monitoring the reports that the companies submit, also handling complaints. But who's bringing in the complaints? Well, civil society has to do that, yeah? So in a way, we're back with a similar situation. We need civil society actors, we need trade unions to monitor, to file complaints, and we need this regulatory body to do something then to follow up on the complaints. And right now there are a lot of question marks as to how this will be done and also how this will be dealt with on a corporate level. Yeah? It shifts to legal, which might be a good thing. It might also mean that the issue will be understood very narrowly in terms of legal compliance, yeah? Which is maybe not what the idea is. So there are a lot of uncertainties in this case. So to sum up and now move to some reflections, what this might mean for education. So for me, this idea of market-protected spaces links very nicely with this donut economy idea of Kate Raworth. Yeah? Why? Because it has to do with boundaries. No? So we have social boundaries, that's at the core of the donut, and we have planetary boundaries. And it seems that the way the market logic is currently defined and enacted does not respect these boundaries. Yeah? And in a way, these governance solutions that we observed in these industries are an attempt at setting some of these boundaries, yeah? Creating agreements, be it in the public realm or be it through public regulation, to try and build respect for these boundaries into the economic system. Yeah? But what I tried to indicate is that still none of these solutions are necessarily extremely effective, and they're all extremely fragile at the time being. Yeah? But what it means is a change in institutions, and this change in institutions should be accompanied, of course, by change then in management practices. The thing is, and this is an important part for education, is that, okay, we have science, or we have the climate science that tells us more or less what these boundaries are and where we are in overstepping them. But we do not necessarily have agreement on the solutions. Yeah? And this is where management education comes in. Yeah? So what we as educators can do is to educate about the boundaries, yeah? But also sensitize our students that the solutions need to be socially negotiated, and there are no fit-for-all solutions. There are trade-offs, yeah? And sustainability research has shown this for years. The trade-offs, the tensions, yeah? There's the triangle, well, the triple bottom line. Well, there is no triple bottom line in most cases, right? There is no business case. We cannot serve all. We need to make trade-offs. We need to prioritize. And this is also what this market-protected spaces idea entails. It's creating some boundaries to be able to prioritize responsibility in areas where we think it's really necessary. So as educators, what is the role of business schools in this process? Well, one suggestion I have is to move away from a kind of business case orientation to a boundary orientation, yeah? Whatever this entails, communicating there is not always a win-win solution. Maybe in some areas there is, but when we look at these big challenges, often there isn't. This also means bridging our own boundaries, right? Now we're moving into legal issues, so we need legal expertise. We need, of course, climate science. Yeah, we need to be able to understand these boundaries. We need a geopolitical orientation. We need to really move beyond a narrow understanding of what business is towards bringing in also other disciplines and understanding where these boundaries come from. This also means, of course, focusing on new leadership skills. Yeah, of course, increasing a kind of values orientation. Yeah. Sensitizing to this idea of leading by example. Yeah, every one of us is kind of responsible, also us as educators, in being very serious about these topics, recognizing these tensions and the need to prioritize, as I mentioned, and also then training things like negotiation skills. Yeah, so we need to negotiate what we value. No? So we need to be able to debate, and we need to be able to negotiate. And these are the kinds of skills that I think future leaders need to possess. Foster design as well as process thinking. So yes, we can teach about governance solutions, possibilities, but all of these are processes. Yeah, as I tried to show with the due diligence legislations, it's a process by which this law becomes shaped and enacted. Yeah, so really sensitizing our students to this kind of process thinking, I think is important to enable them to be able to be a part of these processes and shape these processes. We also need to, we work a lot with cases, with singular examples. Yeah, why? Because these problems are big and we don't have a lot of solutions. So we need to also think about how can we learn to transfer insights across contexts. I would say this is a specific skill that we can practice in the classroom. Which links to the next point, which is kind of a need for hope and actionable insights. Yeah, this is something that I've taken from a game, the Climate Fresk game, which is about conveying climate science to students. They say we need these 3 levels, head, heart, and hands. Yeah. And this I find is something that's extremely important when talking to students about these big responsibility challenges. We can think analytically, yeah, but students are moved by these issues, they're concerned by these issues, so we also need to give a space for that in the classroom, yeah, so students can share their concerns, share their feelings of sadness or anger or whatever. And we need the hands. We need to produce some kind of actionable insights. We need to empower the students to do something, yeah, not to come out of the classroom frustrated and depressed about the future. So I think these are things that we all as educators need to build in very systematically into our teaching, and that also means that we as educators need to educate ourselves. Yeah, so climate science is not an easy thing to understand. When I play this Climate Fresk, every time I have to get my head around the facts because I'm not a climate scientist, right? And business schools, I would say, really need to create an environment for continuous learning for us as educators as well. So we need to foster systems thinking in a nutshell. We need to change curricula quite systematically, yeah, to allow this kind of opening and also the boundary orientation. We also need to question our own market logic maybe a little bit, yeah, as business schools in particular. And along with that goes a need to create a sustainable organizational environment, yeah, because if even business schools as a organization are not sustainable, neither when it comes to working standards, nor when it comes to certain environmental standards, how can we lead by example? And how can we have legitimacy in discussing these things in the classroom? There are, of course, many opportunities that we can explore and also, I would say, need to explore, and that's what I want to end with. So I mentioned the Climate Fresk. This is a picture of when I used that in the classroom. So it's a set of cards to convey climate science, and here the head, heart, hands, where students can reflect about their experience. And there are many tools like that. Yeah, in the session earlier, someone mentioned the En-ROADS game, for example. So I think we really need to bring these tools and games and simulations into our classroom, not least to practice this kind of values orientation, negotiation skills, systems thinking, and things like that. We need to maybe also think and create new cases for teaching. Yeah, given that we need some hope and optimism to think about success stories, even though they're rare to find. Yeah. And of course, then also collaborate, create global classrooms. They're really interesting MOOCs, so making also this knowledge accessible to maybe less privileged people. I think all of these are important when we try to achieve these aims. Yeah, we can collaborate now using digital technology. We don't need all the knowledge ourselves, but we can collaborate with legal colleagues, for example, or with colleagues from the science department in creating a course or courses that can bring in these planetary and social boundaries. So that's what I want to end with, and thank you for the attention, and I look forward to the discussion.